Hello, and thank you for joining us for our conversation, COVID-19 and Hunger. We have with us today 4 wonderful panelists, each working to build equitable food systems, innovating with how their organizations redistribute food and resources to those who need them most, and all whose work aims for an end to food insecurity. We invite you to add your voice to the discussion by using the hashtag #SmithsonianFood. I'm Amanda Moniz, the Curator of the History of Philanthropy at the National Museum of American History. Philanthropy to me means recognizing and supporting the humanity of others. And so I'm very pleased to have the chance to moderate this conversation with 4 people on the front lines of food philanthropy. I'll introduce them in alphabetical order, and I'm sorry I don't have time to do full justice to their accomplishments with my brief introductions. Devita Davison is the Executive Director of FoodLab Detroit. FoodLab is a nonprofit organization that fosters the creation of an equitable local food economy by providing food entrepreneurs with education, peer-to-peer mentoring, and access to market opportunities. By primarily focusing on supporting women-owned food businesses from communities of color, FoodLab aims to improve Detroit's neighborhoods by allowing everyone to take part in the development of a local food culture. Vinny Eng is a community organizer and founding member of San Francisco New Deal, a rapid response program formed to support neighbors facing food insecurity and to provide immediate financial relief to local small businesses. To date, SF New Deal efforts in response to COVID-19 have provided over 800,000 meals and granted $8 million to the San Francisco community. Kim R. Ford is the president and CEO of Martha's Table. Her experience before taking the helm at Martha's Table includes serving as Deputy Assistant Secretary and Acting Assistant Secretary in the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education. She also served as Dean of Workforce Development and Lifelong Learning at the University of District of Columbia Community College and in the Obama administration's Recovery Implementation Office. Lyndon Novick O'Keefe is the CEO and co-founder of Common Threads, an organization she started with chef Art Smith and artist Jesus Salguero in May 2003 as a platform for nutrition education programs promoting real behavioral change. Common Threads work includes in-school, after-school, teacher and provider trainings, and family programming at more than 750 schools and community partner sites, serving 580,000 children in 13 major U.S. cities. She also currently serves on the Smithsonian's Kitchen Cabinet. I'm delighted you're all here today. And the first question I want to talk about is how COVID-19 has shaped or reshaped your work. COVID-19 has exposed and worsened inequities in food access. Before the pandemic, 37 million Americans were food insecure. The number has risen since the pandemic began. According to recent reporting by Laura Riley, a recent Feeding America survey showed that food banks in its network had seen an average of a 56% increase in demand in September, as a snapshot of what hungers look like across the country. We know that Black and Latino families are 2 times more likely to experience food insecurity as white families are. The shutdown has also exacerbated food insecurity by closing institutions where people have gotten meals in the past, such as schools. So each of your organizations is tackling food insecurity. I'm going to ask you each how the pandemic has shaped or reshaped your work. So Devita, could we start with you? Could you tell us what FoodLab does and how COVID-19 has reshaped your work?
Sure. Again, my name is Devita Davison, and I, really want to take the opportunity to thank the Smithsonian, and so excited to be here for Food History Weekend. So thank you for inviting me. My name is Devita, and I'm the Executive Director of FoodLab Detroit. It's a nonprofit organization that supports food entrepreneurs who are local Detroiters, and these entrepreneurs really have the opportunity to start, to grow, to incubate and accelerate their locally owned business. I think the thing that makes FoodLab unique in a sense is that we're more than just an incubator and an accelerator, but we operate at the intersection of food entrepreneurship and small business development and movement building. And how COVID-19 has impacted our work is that at FoodLab Detroit, we already knew that our food system was broken. How we produce and how we process and how we distribute and consume food, we already knew that that was a broken system. And so I love the fact that you lifted up the millions upon millions of folks who go food insecure or people who are hungry. To give you a little bit of context in terms of how that looks in Detroit, about 70% of adults and 40% of our youth in Detroit are either overweight or obese. 35% of Detroiters live under food apartheid. That means that they live in communities where they have limited access to healthy food. They live farther from a grocery store than they do a fast food restaurant. Therefore, they're experiencing high rates of diet-related diseases. We know that produce quality is lower in predominantly Black low-income communities compared to our adjacent suburban communities, which tend to be mixed income and also mixed race. But I think the statistic that troubles me the most, and the reason why I'm so excited about this conversation, is that 1 in 4 children in the United States face hunger. And in Southeast Michigan, where Detroit is located, 200,000 children face food insecurity and live in poverty. And the reason why I lift that up in terms of COVID and how we do our work and how our work has really not really changed, but we've emphasized and doubled down in our work, is because I believe hunger in too many situations, not only in Detroit, but all over the world, is treated as a charity issue. When hunger is not a charity issue at all, hunger is a justice issue. And so at FoodLab Detroit, and the reason how our work continues to stay the same is that we look at hunger from a justice framework. We look at hunger from a racial equity framework. That means that the dramatic inequality, the unequal environmental burdens, and the unequal access to fresh, healthy food, we have to double down on that. That's why at FoodLab and many organizations that are located on the ground, doing grassroots organization, doing food work, movement building, we do not call our communities food deserts. So FoodLab and other organizations that we are in community with do not call our neighborhoods food deserts, because desert is a natural phenomenon. Having lack of access to fresh, healthy food is not natural. It's not accidental. So many of our communities, Black and Brown, lack access to fresh, healthy, and affordable food because of structural inequality, deliberate public and private resource allocation, and the exclusion of healthy from our communities. And so COVID has revealed back. It's pulled back the onion layers on structural and racial inequality in our country. And we plan as a nonprofit organization to continue working with Black and Brown entrepreneurs, not only to start locally owned businesses, which we think is important, but to also address racial and inequity issues that we're facing in our community. And so that's how we're continuing to double down and even go deeper in our work.
Vinny, I know you've also been thinking about structural issues. Could you talk about how the pandemic led to the creation of SF New Deal?
Yes, thank you so much. I want to take this time to express my gratitude to the other panelists today. It's quite an honor to share this panel with the other panelists. My name is Vinny Eng. I'm the community organizer for SF New Deal. Prior to the COVID shelter in place, SF New Deal did not exist. But on the second day that the mayor of San Francisco implemented a shelter in place, we got on our feet and we started making food, because we were a group of like-minded individuals, all groomed and raised in the food and or hospitality industry, deeply impacted by the immediate distress caused by the shelter in place. The hospitality and restaurant industry is a safe haven for a lot of marginalized communities, and a lot of small operators provide a really important and necessary outlet for communities for realizing and achieving self-determination, agency, and economic opportunity. And the shelter in place really created a lot of chaos and massive layoffs of individuals. So we saw right away from the shelter in place that the disproportionate burden of that impact would be borne by people of color, queer communities, and women. And so SF New Deal came together as a rapid response to direct financial relief to the most vulnerable small businesses, businesses operated by Black and Brown and Asian communities, as well as women and queer operators as well, because we knew that government relief would not come for weeks, if not months. And so a group of 4 of us got together, and on day 1, we made 100 sandwiches, and we teamed up with a local organization and went out to the streets and started handing out food. And within the second week, we were making 3,000 meals a day. And to date, actually, we are nearing $9 million in funds provided to restaurants to make and distribute prepared meals to those who need them throughout the city and county of San Francisco. We made an intentional commitment to spend much more per meal than traditional charity hunger relief organizations. And this was a signifier that no matter the level of your need, everyone deserves a nutritious, well-made, well-sourced meal. And to Devita's point, we were committed to taking this crisis moment and triaging for the need in the immediate and imagining how a new system of collective care could be built at the same time. So we are a group of individuals really committed to solving for multiple solutions, solving for structural issues. We have many businesses that laid off anywhere from 70 to 90% of their staff at the immediacy of the shelter in place. And a lot of those staff members are immigrants, and a lot of those staff members to this day have not been able to access social insurance programs like unemployment. In the restaurant industry, which is notorious for extracting labor and exploiting certain communities for profit, it was really important for us to acknowledge and work with operators who understood the moral commitment that they had to their workers, that if these government relief programs weren't offering a safety net to catch them, that there were community resources that could be activated and community infrastructure that could be leveraged to catch and hold and support individuals through their most distressful moments of need. And so it's really important to acknowledge that in this time, hunger doesn't care if you're documented. Hunger doesn't care if your skin color is one thing or another. We as individuals and community need to lift up those that are closest to harm. And so it became really central to SF New Deal to center our impacted communities in asking for what solutions were important to them. And overwhelmingly, they conveyed to us that choice was important, that they had the agency and ability to decide how to feed themselves and their families, and to be part of the conversation about the systems that delivered food to them. And so what we did at SF New Deal was decentralized the solutions into neighborhoods. We have over 116 restaurant partners now that we churn to match needs to resources so that we can better meet the appropriate cultural considerations depending on the populations that we're feeding.
To borrow a phrase from Vinny, Kim, I know Martha's Table's been lifting up communities for around 40 years. Could you talk about how the pandemic has changed the work of Martha's Table?
Absolutely. So thank you to the Smithsonian. Thank you, Paula, Amanda, fellow panelists, and certainly our esteemed board member, Joan Nathan, who helped connect us in. We're so proud to be a part of this. And you are absolutely right. This is our 40th anniversary. We are 40 years old and 40 years strong. It's what we always talk about. Martha's Table supports residents in the District of Columbia for strong children, strong families, and strong communities. We do this through quality education, through health and wellness, of course, through food programming, and through family and community supports. So, in March, COVID landed on us. It landed on everyone. We're very proud that we actually never closed and have never closed throughout all of this, but it has changed our operations in a number of ways. So first, we had to actually place our early childhood education centers on virtual learning. We have young people, nationally accredited early childhood education centers, young people 6 weeks to age 4. And we placed that programming on virtual learning, but we knew that we didn't know anything about COVID, but we knew that it was going to hit our communities the hardest. We are in the most economically disadvantaged communities in the District of Columbia. And to the other panelists' points, this is a situation about equity, and responding to that, what we did was actually launch a comprehensive support program for those families, for those parents. We actually started our first ever cash transfer program. We put $9,000 in the hands of every single one of our families. Plus, we gave them monthly supplies of diapers, wipes, and formula. Plus, we gave them monthly supplies of groceries as well. And so that was a big shift for us. That was something that was very new for us. But again, we knew that it was going to hit our families hard. About a month into this pandemic, 90% of our families said that they had been negatively impacted financially because of COVID, and that those financial resources that we provided helped them stay afloat and help reduce stress in their household. And we know what stress can lead to, usually things that are not productive. And so we're very proud to do that. in our food operations. We have lobby markets here in our beautiful headquarters in Southeast, also our campus in Northwest. We have lobby markets where people come in and they shop. We also have joyful food markets at every elementary school in Ward 7 and 8, where they're pop-up markets. Kids actually come and shop. All of this is at no cost to the community. But obviously with COVID and the health concerns, we had to pivot. We had to pivot, and we had to pivot quickly. And what we did was we actually went to a pre-bag bag and go model, so we could have a contactless model. Now, what that meant was we had to have far more people power, right? Because now instead of you coming in and shopping, we are bagging it up for you so that we can have something at the door for you to be able to pick up and go. So that took a tremendous increase in people power, where we actually saw a drop in volunteers. We had placed the team on mandatory telework where people could volunteer to opt in. Not surprisingly, a lot of people did not volunteer to opt in. So here we have this mismatch of needing a lot of people power and not having the people. And then we saw demand just shoot through the roof. Almost overnight, we went from distributing 500 bags of groceries a day to 2,000 bags of groceries a day. And it has not stopped. We are about 6 or 7 months into this. And once we saw that jump, it has held. It has not stopped. When DCPS, the DC public school system, closed the schools, we have continued to support the food operations at all of the meal sites in Wards 7 and 8. And because we also knew our community and understood transportation issues, safety issues, we, for the first time, launched community pop-up markets. So we actually went directly into the community and had pop-up markets at non-school locations, and continue to distribute hundreds and hundreds of bags of groceries through that. So a lot changed for us. Our McKenna's Wagon, which is our longest standing program, it is our free food truck that goes out every day this year, 366 days a year, no matter weather, no matter holiday, no matter global pandemic, right? We have never missed a day with McKenna's. With our team on mandatory telework, our chefs who used to support that may or may not have been opting in. We were lucky enough, and I really appreciated Vinny's comments on, making sure that the meals are great. We were lucky enough to have some partnerships with some great restaurants in DC. And so, we had a partnership with Clyde's and Succotash. And man, I'm telling you, there was some great meals. But even there, we used to see about 100 to 125 guests at McKenna's a day, over 200 a day. So everything has just jumped, but we have stood alongside the communities that we support. We continue to stand alongside them. People say, how are you doing this? How are you going to sustain this? We don't know, but we just keep going, right? We just focus on the mission, focus on the people, and keep providing everything that we can. And the last thing that I will say is our bags of groceries, they are healthy. They are healthy fruits and vegetables and shelf life items. And we're very proud of that. And recently, one of our community members was interviewed just randomly. And she said, you go some places and they give you, chips and a hot dog. You go to Martha's Table, you get something that's nice, it's nutritious, it'll sustain you for several days. So we're very proud of that. And again, we just continue to pivot and be flexible and respond and stand alongside the community. So again, thank you so much for having us, and really appreciate this panel and this conversation.
Thank you. Linda, your organization also pivoted. Before the pandemic, your mission focused on cooking and nutrition education. And because of COVID-19, you pivoted to food distribution. Could you talk about making that shift and about how you're working to maintain your usual mission?
Sure, absolutely. So common threads for the past 16 years has been providing in-person nutrition education and cooking programs across the country. We go into the schools, we provide age-appropriate, hands-on cooking classes, snack making classes in the schools, in community. We teach kids how to make healthy, affordable meals that are under $10 to feed a family of 4, using on average 5 ingredients. We teach teachers to implement nutrition education in the schools so they can be champions for health. We do grocery shopping tours. So COVID has really hit us. My team at Common Threads, the one thing that they all say is the worst thing about COVID is just that they want to get back into the kitchens. We already had a digital platform, so it really allowed us to continue to innovate in this virtual space. We really ramped things up. We called upon our celebrity chef friends. We were able to provide a virtual summer camp for kids across the country where they cooked, and with celebrity chefs like Gail Simmons and Art Smith and Michelle Bernstein and Monte Carlo. They did spoken word, capoeira, hip hop. But on average, we usually teach about 50,000 kids during the summer months. And in comparison, this summer, we taught about 2,500 during our summer camp. We did, as you just said, we did food distribution for the very first time, something I never in a million years thought we would get into, but I was really proud of the Common Threads team for quickly retooling a programmatic solution to be able to meet our children and families where they were. This is just a point of the importance of local organizations like all of ours, is that we really know our communities intimately and have those relationships to be able to really be able to give the food to the kids and families. So for example, we were able across the country when COVID struck, we quickly started partnering with the school districts, YMCAs, to train their staff members. They were teaching kids of health workers during the day. So we provide breakfast, lunch, and dinner for them. We train the YMCA counselors how to incorporate nutrition education into the daily programming. We provided pantry boxes for our families where they'd have enough food for an entire week. We coupled that with chef prepared meals for a family of 4 and gave them access to our website so they could make whatever was in that box. So, yes, it's been a real change. I think COVID has thrown us all for a loop. But again, I just commend all of the panelists and their organizations for what they're doing, how they're doing it. It shows just how flexible and nimble all of us have really had to be during this time.
Absolutely. Kim made a comment about sustainability, being concerned about not knowing how these efforts will be sustained over time. And that's something I wanted to ask all of you about. Has the pandemic created permanent goals for your organization? Do you anticipate sustaining what you're doing now? Or do you see the changes you've made as short-term emergency solutions? And I thought, Vinny, we could start with you, since SF New Deal emerged in the crucible of the pandemic as a rapid response program.
Thank you for that question. I think it's clear from all of our relief work during COVID that there was a real immediate need to make sure that our communities were fed. And food is such a portal for renewal, but we also have to acknowledge that food for far too long has not been a policy priority in a lot of local, state, and the federal government. And how this manifests is it leads to adverse experiences in communities which are disproportionately borne by communities of color. That poverty and hunger are policy choices that are made by our elected officials. And a lot of these, the running joke among all of the community organizations here in San Francisco is that COVID-19 completely upended everyone's mission statement in the weeks that immediately followed the shelter in place, and every single community organization became a feeding organization. Because, when you're confronted with massive uncertainty and chaos and disruption to your daily lives, you tend to your most basic needs, which are shelter and food. And so while the efforts that we've been able to manifest in these last 6 months are really important to ensure that our communities are fed, we really need to take this opportunity while the window is still open to really demand a different approach to how we solve for food access, how we solve for and dismantle structural barriers to healthy outcomes, which are all expressions of racism. A lot of these policy choices are manifest in ways that, again, all of the panelists in one way or another have referenced the disproportionate cost of COVID. It's being borne on the communities that have for far too long have shouldered the trauma of poverty, the trauma of the lack of access to the choice of how to keep your families healthy and nourished. And so what I hope for in this moment is that COVID has really atomized communities to disperse aid in so many different ways. We have deputized legions of individuals who care more now than they did before and are more aware of the ways in which racism exists in our communities. And what I hope for this moment and what I hope for our communities is that we will leverage this awareness and this understanding and transmute the distress that's being experienced all over this country into a radical way of thinking that centers compassion in leadership.
Linda, you explained to us that you've made quite a number of changes in your programming. Could you talk about what changes you see as sustainable and what are short-term solutions?
Sure. Well, for our organization, we want to get back into the schools, into community organizations. There's nothing like in-person learning. At the same time, I do think the virtual education is sustainable. It's allowed us to reach kids across the country in cities that we're not in. So that part of it has been helpful for us. But, like Vinny said, I think this is really a policy issue. The issues around food insecurity that have come up during COVID are nothing new. They're really just more pronounced. This is going to take really strong, robust partnerships across sectors to really get to changes. Being able to make healthy choices where we work, live, and play has to be a real priority. This means, in addition to the USDA has made so many enhancements to SNAP, and that needs to continue. Local food banks are stepping up. Organizations like ours have really no business doing food distribution, so that's certainly not sustainable. We have to think about, Vinny talked a little bit about mental health, right? This is Mental Health Week. So there's a real correlation between mental health and obesity. Obesity bias is real, and there's a real correlation between stress and trauma and obesity. And I think that across systems in education, we have to acknowledge that kids are receiving most of their meals in the schools. The amount of children right now, because they are home experiencing additional trauma, this is going to affect generations to come. And so building healthier, sustainable communities is more critical now than ever.
Kim, I wonder if you could also speak to this issue of the sustainability of your current efforts and how it relates to policy shifts Martha's Table may be hoping to see.
Right. So, a lot of this is not sustainable. We've already seen the lack of sustainability from when the pandemic first hit. I mentioned these great partnerships we had with restaurants in DC, and those partnerships have ended because their funding dried up, right? Nobody thought that this was going to go this long. We had amazing partnerships with other organizations where people were, giving us things like those meals for McKenna's Wagon. Those ended. And so therefore we had to then start buying things, obviously, and perhaps this is my fault as the CEO did not budget for what is now a 5-fold increase for food. And so, I think when we talk about things in terms of sustainability for us, it's about cost and redirecting funds. And again, we are committed to stand alongside the communities and to see our communities through this pandemic and what we believe is going to be a long path ahead. When we talk about policy, one of the things that we would like to see be sustainable is actually the cash transfers and really working in economic mobility. Because when you have financial hardship, it makes it very difficult for you to access healthy foods and fresh and healthy foods. So, there's a reason that your zip code dictates your life, right? Your zip code is inextricably linked to the median income of that zip code. And it tells you by zip code, the likelihood of your educational, economic, and health outcomes. And it is no surprise that COVID is wrecking the zip codes that have the lowest economic standing. So in DC, the average income is $84,000. In the community that we are in here, our headquarters is $34,000. And we can link, again, all of this back to racial equity, because, again, not surprising, the zip codes start to align to certain races, Black and brown, especially here in D.C. So really, I see the policy conversations being, we've got to get people out. I appreciate my colleagues' comments around SNAP. We would like to see people off SNAP. Right. And then think about the gap between getting off SNAP. Like if you get some more money and lose that benefit, but how far is it for you to actually be at a family sustaining wage? There's a huge gap there. Right. And so then there's this cycle that keeps happening, and the system reinforces you to continue in the cycle, because if you carry, for example, here in DC, more than $2,000, more than $2,000 in your bank account, your benefits will start dropping. And I can tell you here in the great District of Columbia, $2,000 does not get you very far at all. And so I think a lot of the policy that we are interested in, of course, linked to education, of course, linked to food, but it is also linked to the economics, because once you start to see that shift and you start to see that median income increase, what also happens? The education gets better somehow magically. Grocery stores, healthy grocery stores start appearing magically. We could use all kinds of words for it. People talk about gentrification and all kinds of stuff. But the point is the money moves. And when the money moves, the rest of the system moves, and typically either in a positive or negative direction, depending on which way the money moves.
Thank you. Devita, I want to turn to you now, since gentrification has also been an issue in Detroit. FoodLab builds on Detroit's longtime robust urban agricultural ecosystem. I'm curious if you could talk about this issue of the sustainability of your work, because I was sort of wondering if it's a different issue for you because there is this long tradition of urban agriculture and community gardens in Detroit that you're building on. So is sustainability for your current COVID-related efforts an issue, or have you had to take these short-term emergency measures, or do you continue to build on a sustainable basis?
Right. So what's interesting about the city of Detroit, particularly at this time, is that, yes, we are in the middle of a global pandemic. Yes, Black and Brown communities have been disproportionately affected. But I think the city of Detroit is uniquely positioned, not because we're immune from the effects of COVID. It's because we have been in a situation where our city has had to face disaster capitalism before. And this is the crisis that we're in. Black and Brown communities stay in crisis. COVID just happened to be a crisis that is now affecting the whole entire world. And so my city, the city of Detroit, filed for the largest municipal bankruptcy that this country had ever seen in 2015-16. And so we understood that capitalism and the way that it plays out in this country is not sustainable, right? That's the thing that's not sustainable. We also understood that corporate control of our food systems that rely on exploiting people and our planet are not sustainable. So when we talk about the sustainability factors, what we know is that the systems that in which create our food system currently as we know it, these systems aren't sustainable. So how do we plan for an unsustainable system that has been created? That's the work that we do. That's the work that we will continue to do. And that's the work that FoodLab builds off of. When you come from a city like I do, when every single national and regional grocery store left your city, a city of over 700,000 people, and you had no grocery stores, what do you do? What do you do to feed your babies? What do you do to feed your community? What do you do to feed yourself? We had land in the city of Detroit. And so the urban agricultural movement started out of crises. And that crisis was, how do we take the assets that we had in our community, food, proximity and access to water, a willing, a knowledgeable community of folks who had migrated from the rural South to the North, who knew how to grow food because of that agricultural skill set that they have, right? And then the need for us to grow our own fruits and vegetables. And so what we know is that what is sustainable and what we work for in the city of Detroit is control and power and sovereignty, right? And so when we talk about, this sustainability factor, is that the question is, how do you sustain a movement? That's what we ask ourselves in the city of Detroit. That's why we work with urban agriculture. And we work within the urban agricultural movement, and we work with farmers at FoodLab Detroit. Yes, we are an incubator that supports and scales and grows locally owned food businesses. We think that's important. Ownership, local ownership, not having corporate control and dominance in our communities and neighborhoods. Local ownership is important to us, but so is supporting our urban farmers. And so how might we be able to locally source our ingredients from the 1,600 farms and gardens in the city of Detroit so that our chefs, our cooks, our food entrepreneurs could then process them and they can show up on the plate? And so what we are about in the city of Detroit and what we know about how to sustain a movement and what is important is something that we have been talking about a lot in Detroit, and that is that we cannot confine the food movement within the parameters of just food. So if we're talking about sustainability, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how do we take this particular moment and really begin to look at the term food movement in a way that goes beyond how people shop, in a way that goes beyond how people eat and how they access that food. But we begin to build what's called a social movement. Because what we really are all about in the city of Detroit and how we sustain a movement is that we have to talk about, how do you dismantle power, right? And so for us, it's like, how do you combat corporate power in the food system? And you do that by understanding that you have to have alliances outside of food. And those alliances must be diverse. They must be intersectional. And we now are talking about how do you do coalition building with groups that are also experiencing injustices that threads to the livelihood of corporate power as well. So in much the same way, we can't reduce the food movement to changing what's on the individual's plate. We can't confine the movement to just food. It has to be more than that. Because what we know is that when we start to challenge the injustices of movement building, and food sits at the intersection of so many things. It sits at the intersection of climate justice. It sits at the intersection of the divest and invest in our community, the defund police movement. It sits at the intersection of the labor movement with the fight for 15 for food workers all over the country who are demanding higher wages. We know that we have to be proximate to those and center those people and those lived experiences of individuals who are low income, indigenous, Black and brown, people of color. And we have to build and start doing coalitions, talk about a movement. Because here's what, and I'm listening to my amazing panelists, and what they have shown me and what they have shown the country is that Black and indigenous and people of color and low income people and low income folks is that we know how to get the job done because we are accountable to our community. We are in our community. So when it talks about the sustainability of our organization, whether it be FoodLab or my panelist organization, I then have to question the practice of philanthropy. I have to ask, if you are impressed with the work that we have been doing in this moment, then is philanthropy then going to look at how they resource BIPOC-led organizations? Because what's unsustainable is that if you want a different impact in our communities, then you have to stop resourcing white-led organizations who have established relationships with funders who you pay and you fund to do work in BIPOC communities. Why aren't you funding the organizations that are already in those communities? So it's time for food systems work and food system funders to center to, in my opinion, if you want to see sustainability, and if you want to see our organizations around, you have to center your funding around racial equity. And you have to do it in a way that you partner with BIPOC communities. You have to examine your own funding trends, and you have to stop funding white-led organizations to come into our communities to do the work that we can do.
Devita's raising issues that have been a big part of conversations in philanthropy circles recently, and I'm hoping we'll come back to that. But before we return to the issue of philanthropy and fundraising, one thing I've been wondering about, which Devita's comments also got to, is this issue of local solutions and larger systemic, and all of you have been talking about larger systemic issues. So you're all emphasizing in different ways local solutions, yet many people's lives and communities are far-flung and cross state and national borders. Can or should our local solutions take account of the geographically extensive nature of communities? I'm hoping you can each speak to that. And Linda, I thought we'd start with you since your organization has a national scope.
Absolutely. So I'm a firm believer that the best national solutions start at a local level. Having worked now in 12 different cities, 5 different states, what I've learned is that there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. Every city, every community is different. Within one city, there might be 17 different neighborhoods. Every school is its own ecosystem. So it's a top-down, bottom-up, inside-outside kind of job to really breathe life into wellness policies, to be able to forge partnerships. And I do think that it takes a real village. I think that cities where there is a champion at the superintendent level that really cares about health and wellness, understands that it affects attendance and achievement, is critical in this conversation. The retail industry and grocers play a huge role in community. I worked at Shore Bank, the largest and oldest community development bank in the country before starting Common Threads. And there, I learned what it was like for years to work in a food desert, with, I guess, Devita, a food apartheid, and what she calls food apartheid, which I love. I also learned what it meant to work for a company that used a triple bottom line. So success was really three parts: profitability, social responsibility, and environmental sustainability. We need elected officials to be part of those solutions. And then we need state support, right? So right now, HHSC and Department of Education at the federal and the state level, there aren't enough dollars to really embed the kind of programs that we all have right now into the systems. We need to be working with health care systems and hospitals. Right now, we have forged partnerships in Chicago, for example, with the Osher Center for Preventative Medicine, where we're teaching a culinary medicine class to medical school students and then deploying them into the schools that we work with. We're teaching FIU dietetic students in South Florida how to implement our curriculum, and they go into the park districts. There needs to be more funding for those kind of partnerships. Health insurers play a huge role, right? So programs like ours shouldn't just be considered interventions, but prevention needs to be part of that model too.
Vinny, you said our most resilient solutions will be local. So I'd love to hear your reflections on this issue of thinking in terms of local solutions and global ties, because San Francisco's food system built so strongly on the city's global connections.
I think it's important to acknowledge that we all can speak the common language of insecurity, the common language of compassion, the common language of trauma. These are all familiar and unfamiliar experiences for everyone, but they thread us and remind us of our humanity. And what I mean when I say that our most resilient solutions are local is that it's very paternalistic to think that there's one solution from some larger entity, some bigger structure that's going to take care of everyone. That sort of has manifest in the charity model for disaster relief, which really does a disservice because it doesn't advance the dignity of someone who's very much at a time of vulnerability when they're so close to need. And local solutions centering communities that are closest to harm advances dignity. And what that does is it generates capacity building. It generates the capacity for a community to build confidence, to understand that they have more assets than they were conditioned to know. And so when we talk to local governments, we talk to state governments, we talk to federal governments, it's not just about dollars in the bank to pay bills. It's about how are we allocating land resources? Who has access to that land? You know, there's a beautiful network of local, state, and national parks. But if you sort of examine who has access to that land, you'll quickly see it's disproportionately inaccessible. Particularly, I think this moment, hunger has really elevated the awareness around disability justice, that a lack of access to food is immediately felt by people who are disabled, physically disabled or mentally disabled. And that touches different communities in different ways. When we talk about food apartheid and we talk about access, we talk about proximity, the local solutions that are resilient means that the people that are closest to harm are the ones that are most quickly served because they matter just as much as everyone else. And for far too long, I think about food bank lines, the inspirational, sort of the inspirational stories about 4-hour lines, 5-hour lines, people sitting in their cars. And I'm reminded of a story a few years ago, pre-COVID, of a local relief organization that sort of required individuals to stand in line for meal service. And this meant that families would have to pull their children out of school so that they could stand in line to receive one meal that the organization probably budgeted $1.50 for. Imagine the compounding effect of not only the trauma of hunger, but also just the inherent shame that's felt by not having that precious time for your family, having to tell your child that you're pulling them out of an after-school program because you have to wait for food. One of the most innovative developments that I think ever happened with SNAP is moving away from food stamps, the colored little chits that they used to hand out in booklets, to a debit card. It really elevated the privacy for people to determine how to feed their families in need. And so what I mean by local solutions are resilient is that it gives people the privacy to source tools and resources that allow themselves to advance their dignity.
Devita, you've talked about building an economy of place. So I'm wondering if you could talk about this issue of place, building an economy of place when communities and families have long distance ties, their communities are far flung, and how that affects food systems.
Yeah, excellent question. Excellent question. And so I want to, one of my panelists had mentioned it earlier, and I thought it was so important, and I wrote it down because I didn't want to forget it. But one of my panelists talked about the importance of a zip code, and how where you live, your zip code can determine your health and well-being more so than your genetic code. Like, what does it say that where you live, your place, determines the outcome of your social and economic and health mobility in this country? So place is important, and that's why I really love this question. And so I identified myself very early on in our conversation as with my name and the organization FoodLab Detroit, and told you that I am a Detroiter. But what I did not further reveal is that I am a first generation Detroiter. And what that means is that I was the first person in my family that was born in Detroit. So when you talk about these connections, when you talk about this kind of connections amongst cities, my parents migrated. They were a part of the Great Migration, and they came from the rural South in Alabama to Detroit. And it's so important that I mention that, because not only did my mom and dad, but over 6 million African Americans fled the terror of Jim Crow South and the racial violence in the South to the North. And I mentioned that migratory pattern because not only was it the largest demographic sea change this country had ever seen, but it shaped policy in the North. When Black people moved from the South to the North, they were met by anti-Black policies. So when you talk about local policies, and when you talk about creating connections on a local level, that is so important. And the reason why I lift up and I mention that our communities, not only in Detroit, but all across the country where you see Black and brown bodies live under food apartheid, it is because of local policy decisions that were made around local factors, racial segregation, commercial redlining, and policies that were implemented on a local level by our government. It is so important that we start on the local level first. And that transcends across the country, and it doesn't matter what community you're from. So when folks, look at the city of Detroit from an outside looking in and they wonder, oh, why is the city of Detroit, why is there so much concentrated poverty in so many communities in the city of Detroit? I have to remind people that it was local policies that implemented restrictive covenants and did not allow Black people to move out from their communities to white neighborhoods. That's local level. So when people want to ask, well, why does the city of Detroit and these neighborhoods have lack of access to healthy, fresh food? Why do they live under food apartheid? I have to remind people that there was a time when Detroiters, Black Detroiters, we had our own businesses. We owned our own homes. We had our own grocery stores, but it was federal policy through the Urban Renewal Program created through Housing Act in 1949 that destroyed our communities. I have to remind them about how the USDA, through racial policies and discrimination, how they strip Black farmers from their land. So all of this is so important that we understand local policies. And these, again, this leads to systems and institutional and structural changes. If we want to see a different impact in our country as it relates to food, as it relates to hunger, and anything that is connected to, it starts on the local level first. So that was an excellent question. And I challenge people to really start doing the work on a local level around the intersection in terms of how do we dismantle structures on a local level that impact how we process, how we eat, and how we distribute food.
So thank you. Kim, DC has also been undergoing rapid gentrification, as we discussed a few minutes ago, and significant demographic change in recent years with people moving in and out of the city. So I'm wondering how that demographic change affects the local nature of your work.
Right. So I would offer that people are moving in and there are people who are being forced out. Right. And how does it affect the nature of our work? It doesn't, because we have always been hyper-focused on the residents of the District of Columbia. We continue to be hyper-focused on the residents of the District of Columbia. And even though you see all these great gains and, this, that, and the third is happening, we have a number of communities whom we stand alongside, whom we are listening to and learning from, and there's just so much there, and we are trying to do anything and everything we can to be a part of those Washingtonians being able to stay and thrive. Because so many people have been forced out, so many people have been pushed out. And for those who are still here, and there are many, and for those who their dream is to have that business, is to have a nonprofit, is to go to school, finish that degree or get that next academic credential, we want to somehow be a part of that so that you can stay and thrive. Because again, what you see happening in DC, and it's not unlike other communities, you start to see the median income rise. You start to see people getting forced out. And again, you just start to see this tip, and there's a tipping point, right? I mean, there are areas that were just bad, supposedly, or, branded as bad. And then they're good. Boom. And look at that. How did that happen? And then, the Whole Foods shows up and everyone's out jogging. And, and it's like that, but and that's fine. And we welcome Whole Foods and Safeway and Giant and Aldi and everybody else and Lidl. But we want the communities we stand alongside to be those managers. We want them to own the franchise. We want, as we look at some of these last streets down here in the Southeast, with businesses coming, it should be the neighbor's business. It should be that you get to benefit from the mass positive economic developments that are going on. Why do you have to be forced out? We've seen DC many, many, many years ago at a population of 1 million. So we don't need to displace. We can add. We welcome. I'm a native Washingtonian. We're happy to have you. But that doesn't mean we have to displace. And why, if all of this money is coming in and we have such an infusion of development and homes and business, why is it that our families and our communities shouldn't be the first ones to have those opportunities? And again, that's what our work is about here on the local level. And I agree with all of my esteemed panelists that it does start local. And I think that we just have to because we're so focused and doing the work on the ground, I think that maybe what would be helpful is, is every now and then picking our heads up and saying, how can we scale this and make it replicable in other jurisdictions, right? So people don't have to keep reinventing the wheel. And maybe, what works in DC won't work, specifically in Kansas City, but at least if you know enough about our model, you can actually adapt it to what would work there and just all across the country. So you just don't have all of these offshoots. And then if you had that, then maybe we could come together as a broader network, as my colleague talked about earlier, alliances and coalitions. So instead of just, instead of doing all this great work at the local level, in addition to doing all of this great work at the local level, we have like some sort of national band, and then that could probably help us tip some of this federal policy. I know we've got some local policy issues, but we've got some federal policy issues, and you really need, blocks moving to show, again, that interconnectivity that my colleague talked about. All of this stuff, money, health, food, environment, all of that, it's all intertwined and interlinked. And wouldn't it be amazing if somehow we had a great coalition that could basically lobby the federal system and say, how about this? How about we stop spending all of this money on the back end and actually move to core and root cause issues and solve those such that all this other positive stuff can happen. Many people might not want folks to thrive, and many people might not want certain folks to thrive. We certainly do, and we certainly would be happy to work with others who do, and try to get some of these policies dealt with.
So we're just about out of time. And as we wrap up, I'd like to just very briefly return to the issue of funding and philanthropy that Devita had mentioned earlier. The giving season is upon us. It's coming up. So I'm sure you're all thinking about your fundraising plans for the coming months. I wonder if you could each give us very, very briefly a preview of the message you'll be sharing as you approach fundraising for the giving season. So Kim, could we maybe start with you? And I'm curious about this issue because it relates to this issue of equity we've been talking about. Food philanthropy and food people in the food business have been thinking about equity, and so that's the perspective I'm what's making me ask about it. So Kim, if you could start, please.
Sure. I mean, we've spent a lot of time diversifying our funding stream and really diversification on a number of different levels from different types of sources. So corporate philanthropy, individual donors. We have been successful diversifying in terms of all types of demographics. You could just lay any demographic out. And part of that has been intentional, but part of that has been that people are responding to the work that we're doing. And organizations who had not funded us in the past 38, 39 years are coming to the table because of the issue that my colleague Devita talked about. This is now for the first time a Black-led organization, a Black female-led organization, and people are seeing the work that we're doing. We have an amazing team, 1MT. It's a great team, very, very diverse team, and people are saying, hey, wow, maybe Martha Stable has always had a great reputation and has always done great work. And people are starting, there are new organizations and new entities that are taking note, and we appreciate that. And you know, some of it, it's great, you know, that some are taking note, because I'm a proud Black woman. Wish they'd been at the table before, but we're happy to have them. But what I'm most proud of are our neighbors, our guests, our communities, you know, who contribute to us, and it might not be, you know, $100,000 or $10,000 or $1,000, but the fact when you have that real investment, you know, when you have the community, you know, I talked about McKenna's Wagon earlier. You know, folks are facing housing instability, and sometimes they'll give us, you know, 30 cents or $1 and just say thank you. And so, you know, to me, that's that, you know, reflection of really being about the community. And in my opinion, and my view, is that if you're really about the mission, if you're really about the people, you're really about the community and the work, the money will come. And we're just happy that that we have such an amazing donor base, and that it is becoming far more diversified.
Linda, could you speak to this issue?
Sure. You know, like so many other non-for-profit organizations, Common Threads is really feeling the financial constraints of COVID. We have certainly lost funders who have shifted and pivoted towards providing funding for their local United Ways or local food banks, potentially also providing support for Feeding America too. Those, so quite honestly, you know, we had worked so hard on diversifying our revenue with government dollars, as well as foundation dollars, corporate dollars. Event revenue was a big part of our revenue pie. The incredible chef community has, for the past 16 years, has always been the bread and butter of the organization. We had 2 events, one in Chicago and one in Los Angeles, that was planned for, I guess, the week after the shutdown. And then the other one was 2 weeks later. So we lost a considerable amount of revenue from those events. And so it's scary. I guess one of the, I would, you know, so I guess the call to action for me is to support those local charities. I mean, we are a national organization, but certainly have a very local footprint in all of our communities. But so many organizations like ours are looking at, for example, we've been in Los Angeles for 11 years, providing programming for the same partners for 11 years, in Link Housing, at Para Los Niños, at so many different schools in Inglewood, as well as LAUSD school districts. And because of this, we're looking at having to really reduce our footprint. For example, in Chicago, we are going from being in 90 schools to being in approximately 20. So when you talk about health equity, I think it's really important for funders to look at the organizations that have been doing the work. It's so critical right now. And really making sure that those organizations that have been doing the work are at that table with C-level executives and elected officials too.
Devita, I'm going to turn to you. I'm going to just quickly hear about how you're approaching the upcoming giving season.
Yeah, another great question, and I'll be really quick. And that is that if we're talking about food system change, if we're talking about food movement change, we can't talk about food without talking about labor. We can't talk about labor without talking about the economy that is built on the exploitation of labor. And we can't talk about any of it without talking about reparations. And so the language and the messaging that FoodLab is going to be joining hands along with other organizations on a local and a national level whether it's the HEAL Alliance, whether it's the Movement for Black Lives, whether it's the One Fair Wage, is reparations, particularly in how this shows up for FoodLab, since we are an organization that supports locally owned businesses, particularly for Black and Brown and BIPOC owned businesses. And the thing is that the work that FoodLab does cannot be done, cannot have impact without getting assistance from, and I'm talking about major assistance from the federal level. And so because of my fear, and I'm gonna be really frank with this, I am afraid that the recovery of the coronavirus will look much like the recovery of the mortgage crisis that Detroit and a lot of Black and Brown communities experience, where people of color who didn't have the money were forced to give up their assets, foreclosures in the city of Detroit. And their assets were absorbed by Wall Street and the marketplace. It put poor people deeper into debt, and then their assets were flipped in service of making the rich richer. And I'm scared because the U.S. response to COVID right now has shown us the disproportional allocation of resources. A $4 trillion fund, grants and loans and tax breaks. And because I work specifically with locally owned food entrepreneurs, I was taken aback when a bill that included $651 billion in tax breaks, that a corporate restaurant franchise by the name of the Cheesecake Factory, for example, furloughed 41,000 people and claimed a tax break of $50 million. The messaging during the gift-giving season and beyond the gift-giving season is, where is our government bailout? Where's reparations? How is the government seeding Black-owned, Brown-owned, BIPOC-owned businesses, and how are they supporting infrastructure in Black and Brown communities?
And Vinny, the last word on this question goes to you. In newest organization, I'd like to hear you reflect very briefly on the question.
Sure. SF New Deal was an immediate response to a dynamic that was felt very, very deeply by our community, which was under-resourced, undercapitalized small businesses did not have the cash flow, did not have the credit line, and did not have the connections to weather not only the economic shutdown, but what now looks like an 18 to 26 month recovery timeline post-COVID, whatever that may look like. We intentionally centered our model on building new systems that distributed as much financial relief to as many local businesses as quickly as possible, and that we cannot rely on old broken systems to sustain an already anemic landscape for small businesses. There are too many livelihoods at stake here. Too many dreams are being shattered at an incredible rate because of the lack of awareness around how resources are being directed in such an incredibly inequitable way to the individuals that have lawyers and bankers and banking relationships. And so our ask and our impulse is to really command and demand that we preserve the fabric of our communities by investing in local regenerative solutions, because those are the individuals that are meeting this moment and catching everyone in the gaps and in the shadows. And that if we don't catch them now, we'll pay on the back end in an excruciating way. And that there's no better time than now to advance the dignity and well-being of everyone in our community, because every life is important. Every dream is inspirational. And we really are just deeply committed to building a different way forward.
That's a compelling way to end our conversation. Thank you to all the participants for this lively and meaningful discussion. We hope you learned more about the impact COVID-19 has had on our food system. To find more resources about food insecurity, please visit the resource tab on our website. Thank you all again.